Welcome, friend, to another quiet evening with the sleepy historian, where the past unfolds in soft tones and sleepy rhythms. Whether you've come for comfort, curiosity, or just something calm to fall asleep, you're in the right place. Tonight's tale comes wrapped in bells and riddles, cloaked in bright colors and softened by laughter. But beneath the mirth lies a truth more layered than many imagine. We'll be exploring the strange, secretive, and surprisingly important world of the medieval court jester. Those curious figures in floppy hats who dance on the edge of power with a grin and a rhyme. As always, this is boring history for sleep, designed not to wake you with suspense or drama, but to gently ease you into folds of time. This is soft-spoken history documentary storytelling, crafted for bedtime relaxation and peaceful minds. It's calm bedtime storytelling, layered with forgotten facts and history sleep stories that whisper rather than shout. We'll begin, as we often do, by slipping into the rhythms of daily life, imagining what it was like to wake up not as a knight or a king, but as a jester preparing for the day's performance, unsure if laughter might save you or doom you. Then we'll stroll through the life of a famous fool, one whose wit cut deeper than any sword. After that, we'll wander into the archaeological oddities and lesser-known mysteries surrounding jesters. Strange bones, odd sketches, and forgotten footnotes in dusty books. And finally, we'll look at how jesters stood beside royalty, mocking and mimicking their masters in ways that common folk never could. So if falling asleep to boring history is something that soothes you, or if you're a lover of archaeology, Roman history, medieval tales, or simply a calm voice in a noisy world, this story is for you. And if this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. There's something strangely comforting about knowing who else is out there, drifting off to the same soft stories from long ago. So settle in, fluff your pillow, dim the lights, let the torches flicker and the fools begin their dance. Let the bells jingle faintly in the distance. Let the myths unfold, and let us begin. Imagine yourself waking just before sunrise, not in a knight's chamber or a peasant's barn, but in a modest stone room tucked behind a great hall of a medieval castle. The air is cool, the stone beneath you rough, and your blanket smells faintly of straw, smoke, and yesterday's wine. You are not nobility, nor are you a servant in the usual sense. You are something else entirely, a jester, a figure meant to straddle the space between amusement and mockery, between reverence and ridicule. Your morning doesn't begin with prayer or chores. It begins with observation. Before the castle wakes, you listen. A stable hand yawns and shuffles through straw outside. A guard shifts his weight at the gate, his armor creaking softly. Somewhere, a baker begins kneading dough, the scent not yet drifting to the corridors but promising warmth later. You dress not in armor or woolen tunic, but in motley, a patchwork of brightly colored fabrics. Each piece is sewn with care, though none match. Some are gifts from nobles amused by your cleverness. Others are repairs from years ago. And then there are the bells, tiny, delicate ones sewn into your hat and sleeves. Not loud, not clattering, just soft enough to remind others and yourself that you are here to be noticed. Breakfast comes, if at all, from the scraps left behind in the kitchens. A half piece of bread, some cheese not quite spoiled, maybe an apple. No one expects you at the morning meal, but everyone expects you to be ready when they are. By mid-morning, the castle is awake, and you begin your rounds. The Great Hall is where you do much of your work, though few call it that. Here, you play the fool. You tumble. You mimic the gait of the king's favorite knight, just enough to draw laughter, but not offense. You sing rhymes about the steward's love of coins. You recite riddles learned from foreign travelers. You dance with a goose. You balance a cup on your head and sip from it without spilling. And always, Always you watch. You are not just a performer. You are an observer. You see things others miss. The nervous glance of a noble plotting something. The downcast eyes of a servant hiding a secret. The whispered joke at the king's expense. All of it you store away, because the jester is not merely for entertainment. He is, in many ways, the castle's unofficial conscience, the one who can say what others dare not, but only if wrapped in enough humor to keep the edge dulled. Come afternoon, you may be summoned to entertain visiting lords. These are trickier. You do not know their temperaments. A joke that delights one might offend another. So you rely on your sharpest skill, improvisation. You observe. You adjust. You survive. Evening comes with the feast. A long wooden table groans with meats, stews, and bread. The nobles eat heartily, and so might you, if you performed well. Sometimes you're invited to sit near them, a rare honor. Other times, you perform to the meal, leaping between dishes, pretending to juggle apples, or reciting absurd odes to roast boar. But always you keep smiling, because behind every jest is a risk. Displease the king, and you may be dismissed. Displease a visiting lord, and you might find yourself outside the castle walls by morning, or worse. As the fire in the hearth burns low, your performance ends. You return to your chamber. Remove the bells. Fold the motley. Sit quietly. The castle sleeps. You do, too, eventually, dreaming not of applause, but of staying in favor one more day. That is the rhythm of your life. Not quite servant, not quite free, always performing, always calculating, always surviving with wit as your shield and laughter as your sword. Imagine yourself once more, this time not in a castle, but far earlier, perhaps as a child in a dusty village square or a noisy city street. Before the bells, before the court, before the jest. Before anyone called you fool, you learned to observe and adapt. You were not born a jester. You were made into one, shaped by practice, necessity, and survival. The path to becoming a jester was not a straight one. Some were born into it, the children performers, acrobats, or minstrels. Others were picked out for their sharp tongues or uncanny mimicry. A few, often those with physical or mental disabilities, were taken in by noble households to amuse, and over time adopted the jester's garb. Regardless of beginning, the training of a jester was no light task. It involved much more than merely being funny. You learned how to play the lute, not masterfully, but well enough to strum a tune that kept a lord's foot tapping. You practiced the flute, the rebec, even the drums, all tools to punctuate a joke, emphasize a tale, or simply fill the silences during long royal dinners. You knew dozens of songs, bawdy tavern tunes, solemn ballads, nonsensical ditties, and when to use which. Then came language, the jester's true weapon. You memorized proverbs, riddles, and puns in multiple tongues. Latin for the clergy, French for the aristocracy, the local dialect for the servants. You became fluent not only in speech, but in timing, in when to say something and when to hold your tongue. Equally important was your ability to mimic and impersonate. You studied gestures, the haughty tilt of a knight's chin, the shuffle of a weary steward, the overstuffed puffing of a visiting merchant. You observed how people carried themselves and turned those observations into comedy, but always, subtly, always with plausible deniability. Training also meant tumbling and balancing. Some jesters could walk on their hands, juggle knives, or balance atop barrels, but not all were acrobats. What mattered more was presence. Commanding a room with nothing but your voice, your face, and a flick of your wrist. Perhaps the most refined skill, and the most dangerous, was mockery. You were trained to insult without offending, to point out the absurd without being accused of sedition, to wrap criticism in a rhyme or a fable, so clever that your target laughed even as they blushed. For example, if a duke grew too fat to mount his horse, you might compose a song about a noble steed so insulted by its rider's girth that it ran off in shame. The court would roar. The duke would scowl. But nothing would come of it if you did it right. This tightrope of saying too much or too little was one every jester learned to walk. Too tame, and you were boring. Too bold, and you were banished. The training never really ended. Every interaction, every glance was part of your education. But beyond the wit and wordplay was something quieter, an ability to read people deeply. You learned to listen more than you spoke. You watched how the king sighed when he was bored, how the queen's eyes darted when she was uneasy. You saw the way people carried joy or fear or guilt in their shoulders and mouths. You knew how to lift spirits and how to cut someone down with a smile. All of these skills became your armor, because while others had swords or coin or titles, you had only your cleverness and the mercy of your audience. By nightfall, your practice continued. Alone, in that quiet chamber, you repeated tongue twisters and riddles to keep your speech nimble. You sang softly to yourself, trying new rhymes. You told yourself stories. Stories of fools outwitting kings, of peasants tricking lords, of ravens who spoke in rhymes and jesters who whispered truths. And then you slept, dreaming not of applause, but surviving another performance with your dignity and your head intact. Imagine yourself now in the grand hall once again. The flicker of torchlight dances across polished stone and faded tapestries. The king is slumped in his great oak chair, his face weary with the weight of rulership. The courtiers murmur among themselves, their words carefully chosen, measured, masked. And then there's you. You enter, bells on your cap jingling softly, a crooked grin already forming. They expect laughter. They expect distraction. But you carry something more dangerous than comedy. You carry truth. For all the jokes, all the acrobatics and songs, the jester held a curious role, that of the court's unofficial truth-teller. In a society governed by strict hierarchies and tightly sealed lips, only the jester could speak openly. Only the fool could point to the king's mistake and survive. This power was not granted lightly. It was earned through years of careful wordplay and tested loyalty. You could say what others dared not, but you had to veil it in metaphor, in allegory, in rhyme. A poorly received jest might still land you in a dungeon, or worse. Take, for instance, the story of Archibald the Pale, a jester in the service of a particularly prideful duke. When the duke announced a tax increase that would ruin the nearby villages, no one protested. No one but Archibald. He crafted a puppet play in which a fat goose hoarded all the grain from the other birds, growing so bloated that it could no longer fly. The court laughed, the duke chuckled, and the tax was quietly revised days later. Nothing more was said, but those who had ears to hear understood. You see, jesters were observers. With no land to manage, no armies to lead, and no votes in court, they wandered freely. They watched, they listened, and sometimes they whispered. It is no exaggeration to say that jesters sometimes serve as informal advisors or spies. They travel between courts with their masters, overhearing rumors and relaying secrets. Monarchs would ask them in jest what they thought of a treaty, a betrothal, or a campaign, and jesters, cloaking humor, would answer honestly. In the court of a queen, one might quietly note the nervous glances between a visiting envoy and a lady-in-waiting. In the halls of a bishop, one might notice the missing scrolls and hurried scribes. Jesters noticed patterns others missed, because no one paid too much attention to fool. Of course, this power was double-edged. With knowledge came risk. Speak too plainly, and you became dangerous. Play dumb too often, and you were discarded. The best jesters mastered ambiguity. leaving people unsure whether they were clever or merely lucky. A jester might ask the king, "What's heavier, sire, your crown or your conscience?" And the king might laugh, or not, but the question would remain, echoing in the silence. Some jesters were rumored to be deeply involved in politics, subtly steering conversations, shaping opinion, or even carrying messages between factions. It's hard to separate myth from truth. The histories are vague. They rarely mention names. But the stories remain like whispers between the lines of old ledgers. What's certain is this: jesters were not fools. At least, not in the way we think. They understood human nature. They understood power. And they knew that sometimes the only safe way to criticize a king was to make him laugh. So the next time you imagine a jester spinning cartwheels across a royal floor, imagine to the mind behind the grin, calculating, listening, remembering, a man or woman whose survival depended on speaking truths dressed in riddles. A performer, yes, but also, in their own quiet way, a master of influence. The fool, it seems, was often the wisest one in the room. Imagine yourself in the opulent court of Tudor England. The year is 1535. The air is dense with incense and heavy silks. Servants move briskly between towering tapestries and velvet-draped tables. Outside the castle windows, the air carries the scent of crushed rosemary and horse manure. Inside, a storm is always brewing, and few know which way the wind will blow. In this world of intrigue, ambition, and sudden downfall, a single figure walks the line between mockery and monarchy. His name? Will Sommers, the court jester to one of England's most fearsome and fascinating kings, Henry VIII. But who was Will really? Not much is known of his early life. Record suggests he was born in Shropshire, possibly around 1501. A commoner, unremarkable in birth. And yet, somehow, he found himself summoned to court in the mid-1520s. It's said that he was introduced to Henry VIII by a courtier who admired his quick wit and unflappable manner. Whatever the truth, once he arrived, he never left. Will Sommers was more than a jester. He became a fixture of the Tudor court. Through 6 wives, a break with Rome, and the dissolution of the monasteries, Will endured. And perhaps more miraculously, he thrived. What set him apart? Unlike the caricature of a jester we often imagine, capering about with a lute and a slapstick, Will was dry, intelligent, and observant. His jokes were rarely bawdy. Instead, they were sharp, quiet, and laced with commentary that, from anyone else, would be considered treasonous. He was known to tease Henry about his weight, his marriages, and even his policies. Always carefully, always skillfully. And Henry, remarkably, tolerated him. Some even said he loved him. There are tales, soft-footed legends really, that Henry once burst into thunderous laughter when it was suggested the king should marry a bag of coins, as it's the only bride he hasn't grown tired of. A dangerous jest, but it worked. Perhaps because Henry saw it was something rare, honesty without threat. Unlike the nobles who flattered and the clergymen who preached, Will had no ambition for power. He was the only man who could make the king laugh when he least wished to. And in those dark Tudor days, laughter was rare currency. More than once, Will is said to have defended courtiers from Henry's rage. He would intervene with a joke, a rhyme, or a distraction. In one instance, when Henry ordered a servant whipped for spilling wine, Will spilled his own cup in protest, drawing laughter instead of blood. He turned fury into farce. Not always, not reliably, but often enough to matter. And yet, Will was no fool. He understood court politics better than most. He kept his alliances quiet, his loyalties clear. He knew when to speak and when to remain utterly still. He served not only Henry VIII, but also Henry's daughter Mary I. He was present at her coronation, an aging shadow of his former self, and yet still there, still part of the machinery of power. Some say Elizabeth I even kept a jester in memory of him. Will's presence lasted through 3 monarchs. That is no small feat for any Tudor subject, let alone a fool. Perhaps most remarkably, Will Sommers died in his bed of natural causes, in a time when few men close to the throne could say the same. Today, his image survives in a few portraits, tucked into corners of royal paintings, his features half smiling, almost forgotten. But the records confirm his role, not just as entertainer, but as a strange kind of anchor, a pressure valve for one of England's most volatile courts. Imagine it again now, a man in motley silk, walking quietly behind a king feared across Europe, a man who knew when to laugh, and when to save a life with a whispered jest. That was Will Sommers, the wise fool of Tudor England. Imagine the candlelit chambers of a late medieval court, the stone walls thick with tapestries, shadows trembling with every flicker of flame. The court is a place of precision. Every nod, every bowed head, every silence is calculated. At its center sits the monarch, a figure both exalted and terrifying. All eyes are trained on them. All ears await their command. And yet, in this tense choreography of obedience, one figure breaks the rules. The jester. The jester alone is permitted to cross invisible lines, to step too close, to speak out of turn, to raise his voice when others whisper. But this freedom was not without danger. In truth, it was a performance more delicate than a tightrope walk over court's open jaws. The jester's survival depended not just on wit, but on timing, tone, and instinct. When to jest, when to retreat, when to expose a truth wrapped in humor, and when to let silence speak louder. To entertain a king was one thing, but to challenge him with a grin, that took artistry. The medieval monarch, after all, was not merely a ruler, but a divine figure, chosen by God. His will was law, his favor was life, and his anger, death. So the jester's words had to be masked, satire disguised as slapstick, criticism cloaked in comedy. One misstep could end a career, or a life. Historical records give us glimpses into this high-stakes dynamic. Jesters often echoed the frustrations of the court in jokes, saying aloud what others dared not. A clever jester could sway a mood, delay a punishment, or soften a king's fury, but only if he knew how far to go. Take, for example, the story of Archibald Armstrong, a court jester to King James I and later Charles I of England. Archibald was clever, too clever, perhaps. He made biting jokes about the Scottish courtiers and even the king's ministers. For years, he was tolerated, even liked. But eventually, his wit was deemed too sharp, too insolent. He was dismissed in disgrace, banished from court with no fanfare. His story is a cautionary one, a reminder that the king's laughter could turn to wrath in a moment. Still, jesters remained part of courtly life for centuries. They acted as sounding boards, not quite advisors, but not mere entertainers either. Monarchs sometimes relied on them to deliver bad news with levity, or to test public reactions through stage jokes. It's believed that jesters helped monarchs cope with the crushing isolation of power. Kings lived surrounded by sycophants and spies. A jester, honest through humor, could be a rare breath of truth. In France, jesters were so integral that they were granted ceremonial outfits and formal titles. In Russia, the Tsars had jesters who doubled as political messengers, using riddles and rhymes to express state policy. In the Holy Roman Empire, jesters sat at banquets alongside bishops and generals, wearing bells that jingled in tandem with the laughter they drew. But make no mistake, the jester's life was not luxurious. They often lived in modest quarters, relied on royal favor for survival, and could be cast aside without cause. Their freedoms were fragile, conditional, and constantly at risk. Still, many endured. Some even gained influence. A few, like Will Summers, became legendary. Today, we often see the jester as a clownish figure, a joker, a buffoon. But in truth, the medieval fool was something more subtle, a psychological mirror for rulers, a release valve for tension, a whisper of reality behind the velvet curtain of power. He was, paradoxically, both the lowest and one of the most essential figures in court, the one who reminded kings, ever so gently, that they were mortal. So imagine again a dimly lit court chamber, thick with ceremony and silence. A monarch sits heavy in judgment. Tensions rise. And then a voice, light and sharp, breaks the air with a joke. A ripple of laughter. The mood shifts. The king smiles. And for one more day, the jester lives to jest again. Now, imagine the jester not as a source of entertainment, but as a keeper of moods, a chronicler of tensions unspoken. In the courts of medieval and early modern Europe, where official records detailed treaties, battles, and births, the emotional undercurrents of power were rarely preserved. But the jester, the fool in bright colors, bore silent witness to it all, not with pen and ink, but with gestures, glances, and jokes. He recorded not in parchment, but in presence. Jesters, it turns out, were not merely comic relief. They were emotional barometers of their time. Their work captured the pressures of kingship, the loneliness of monarchs, the paranoia of courtiers, and the absurdity of ritual. Through satire and mimicry, they reflected back the contradictions of court life. If a king was loved, the jester might make jokes about his many admirers. If he was feared, the jester's silence might be more telling than a sonnet. These subtle performances conveyed the atmosphere of the palace more truthfully than any chronicler ever could. Imagine now a jester performing on the day after a military defeat. The court is heavy, its spirits low. The jester appears not in riotous color, but in subdued motley, a visual cue that all is not well. His act is softer, his voice quieter, and yet, with one line, one clever twist, he draws a reluctant chuckle from the king. In that moment, the jester has done more than entertain. He's documented the sorrow, acknowledged it, and gently begun to dissolve it. These emotional records, these unspoken truths, were the jester's domain. Consider also the way jesters served queens and noble women. At a time when women's emotional lives were tightly guarded and often invisible in official narratives, the jester offered a rare conduit. A clever fool could coax laughter from a grieving widow, tease out a smile during tense political negotiations, or simply remind a queen that beyond the silks and alliances, she was still human. One story tells of a jester who, during a particularly heated council debate, walked into the room and placed a potato on the king's chair. No words, just a humble tuber, sitting where royal silk normally rested. The silence was long, then broken by sudden, eruptive laughter. The tension in the room eased, and the council resumed with lighter shoulders. The meaning of the gesture? Left to interpretation. But the timing, the absurdity, and the risk? Unmistakably brilliant. Jesters were also memory keepers, not of facts, but of feelings. In household where they served for decades, jesters could recall former kings, old scandals, private sorrows. Their recollections were embedded in jokes and parables, passed down not as history, but as soft stories told over mead or muttered in the corridors. In this way, jesters function as informal emotional historians, tracking not events, but moods, the anxiety before a war, the strain of succession, the humor and hardship. Their presence alone reminded others of past joys, of foolish mistakes, of resilience. Even their costumes, with bells, patchwork, and mismatched colors, were visual metaphors for life's contradictions. They carried symbols of chaos in orderly places. And through that contrast, they taught something deeply human, that laughter and sorrow are not opposites, but companions. In modern psychology, We understand humor as a coping mechanism, a way to process fear, trauma, and uncertainty. The jesters of history knew this instinctively. Their craft was emotional alchemy, transforming dread into levity, discomfort into understanding. So while official court scribes chronicled victories and treaties, jesters preserved something more fragile, the temperature of the soul of the place. They were never the most powerful in the room, but they were often the most observant. And though their words may not have been written down, their echoes survive in the margins, in the stories we still tell, and the truths we still need to hear with a smile. As we leave the soft glow of the king's chamber behind, let us step into another corner of medieval life, one thick with meaning, myth, and mystery, a space where every color, every gesture, every tiny detail of the jester's attire or behavior was ripe with hidden symbolism. Jesters did not just entertain. They signaled, they embodied, they warned. To the medieval mind, symbols weren't decorative. They were alive, potent, and often superstitious. The court jester, with his bells, patchwork coat, scepter, and cap, was a walking cipher. His entire presence was steeped in meaning. Let's begin with the motley, the jester's iconic patchwork costume. Each panel of cloth was a deliberate clashing of colors: red, yellow, green, blue. No harmony, no symmetry. This was intentional. The motley marked the jester as an outsider, someone outside the bounds of social order. In a world where clothing denoted rank, status, and allegiance, the jester's refusal to match was a kind of rebellion and a warning. He belonged to no faction, no house, no allegiance except laughter. The motley was also believed by some to offer protection. In certain regions, it was thought that bright, clashing colors could ward off evil spirits or confusion in the mind, almost like a medieval version of psychological armor. Then there were the bells, tiny, constant, melodic, sewn into caps, slippers, and collars. They jingled with every movement, making silence impossible. But why bells? Bells, in many parts of medieval Europe, were believed to have spiritual power. Church bells were rung to chase away demons. Handbells marked sacred transitions. By sewing bells into their garments, jesters became both profane and sacred, warding off evil even as they mocked the heavens. There was also the bauble, a sort of miniature scepter carried by jesters. It often bore a carved version of the jester's own face or a grotesque puppet head. To modern eyes, it might seem like a toy, but it served as a strange mirror, a prop to mock the powerful or to speak freely when the jester couldn't. In some cases, jesters used their bauble to deliver messages in double. They would ask the puppet a question or let it answer in a silly voice, allowing a second layer of communication. A joke might come from the bauble, not the man. A criticism of the queen might be deflected as just a puppet speaking. It was protection by proxy. And then there were the caps, often fashioned into the shape of donkey ears, coxcombs, or even horns. These weren't just silly shapes. They drew from old symbols of foolishness, fertility, and even devilry. The donkey, in medieval Christian thought, symbolized stubbornness and ignorance, but also humility. To wear its ears was to acknowledge folly, to perform it openly so others wouldn't have to. Even the coxcomb or rooster crest had dual meaning. The rooster, though foolish in folk tales, was also a morning herald, the one who wakes the world. In this sense, the jester, like the rooster, might also be the first to see the dawn of truth before others do. Many believe jesters walked a line between this world and the next. Their behavior, their chaotic energy, their strange dress, all hinted at a connection with the unknown. They were liminal figures, tolerated by nobles, but never fully embraced. Some jesters were feared more than adored. Their sharpness, their unpredictability, their ability to twist words like incantations, all lent them an aura of danger. Superstitions rose around them, Don't cross a jester at dusk. Never take a coin from a fool's hand. If a jester cries, a great sorrow will follow. It's hard to know how much of this was true and how much was theater. But for those living in castles centuries ago, the jester was never just comic relief. He was a strange creature, alive with contradiction, joy and sadness, power and mockery, reverence and ridicule. He embodied chaos, and in doing so, gave others the comfort of order. So next time you see a colorful cap or hear the soft jingle of distant bells in a film or on a stage, remember, there was a time when those symbols weren't quaint. They were feared, respected, sometimes even believed to hold magic. As we drift deeper into the twilight of medieval imagination, the jester's role becomes even stranger, crossing from the physical world into the realm of myth, religion, and spiritual folklore. You see, to many in the Middle Ages, jesters weren't just performers. They were echoes of something older, stranger, perhaps even sacred. Let us begin with a question. Why did the church, so often a voice of order, reverence, and restraint, allow the jester such freedom in a world otherwise bound by rules? In some ways, the jester served a spiritual function. His folly reminded the faithful of their own. He was a mirror of human weakness, loud, foolish, and irreverent. He said the things others could not, laughed at the things others feared. By mocking the world, he gave the world a space to humble itself. One could find echoes of the jester even in religious festivals. Take the Feast of Fools, a chaotic, topsy-turvy celebration where junior clergy dress as bishops. Donkeys were led into churches, and sacred rituals were parroted. The purpose wasn't mock the faith, but to release tension, to allow laughter its moment, so reverence could return cleansed. The jester, in his own way, played the same role. And in folklore, this figure only grew stranger. In some tales, the jester was seen as a trickster, a familiar archetype across many cultures. The Norse had Loki, the Celts had Puck, West African myth held Anansi the spider. These were not evil beings, nor good ones, but chaotic teachers. They disrupted the order of things to reveal a deeper truth. The medieval jester echoed this tradition. He might make the king laugh, but he also reminded him he was mortal. He might tell a bawdy tale, but buried within it might be a lesson on pride, or greed, or fate. In some cases, the jester was believed to be favored by fate itself, protected from punishment, blessed with insight, or cursed to always be misunderstood. There are stories, quiet ones, of jesters predicting death, or appearing where they should not, or knowing things they could not have known. These weren't always taken seriously, but they weren't dismissed either. In medieval paintings, the jester sometimes appears in surprising places, in the margins of religious manuscripts, dancing on the edge of holy scenes, not as a villain, not as a saint, but as something in between. Even in death, the jester held mystery. His tomb, if he had won, might bear a carved face with a crooked grin, or a pair of bells turned to silence. In folklore, it was said that a jester buried with his cap would never truly die. His laughter might still be heard on cold nights, echoing through the stone halls he once knew. And in one particularly strange legend from Eastern Europe, a jester is said to have outlived 4 kings, having whispered something to each one on their deathbeds, something they never shared. Some versions say he was a ghost, others that he made a pact with something beyond. Others say nothing at all, just that he laughed softly, even as the candles burned low. What are we to make of this? Perhaps it is simply that in a world bound by faith, fear, and fate, the jester was a reminder that chaos lives in all of us, that laughter, even foolish laughter, holds power, that wisdom can come in bells and patchwork. And in the deep silence of night, when the fire is low and the stories have been told, you can almost imagine him still, leaning in the shadows, bauble in hand, whispering truths no one else dares to speak. Now that we've wandered to the realm of myth and meaning, let us return gently to the record books. For jesters, strange as they may seem, were real people, real names, real voices that echoed through great halls and stone corridors. Some we know, and others we only glimpse. Let us begin in England with a man named Will Sommers. He served King Henry VIII, the famously mercurial monarch who both founded a church and sent many to the scaffold. Sommers, however, was said to be the only man who could consistently make the king laugh. Short in stature, with a keen wit and a calm presence, Sommers remained a trusted court figure through the reigns of Henry, and even his children. He wore his motley with quiet dignity, rarely cruel and often compassionate. In portraits, he appears in the background, never the focus, but always watching. It is said that he once dared to scold Henry for the way he treated his daughter Mary, and instead of punishment, Henry listened. For in a strange twist of courtly gravity, the fool could speak truth to power in a way no one else dared. Then there was Triblet, the French jester under King Francis I. Triblet was sharp-tongued and often vulgar, dancing on the edge of danger. He once insulted a nobleman so grievously that the king demanded he apologize. Triblet replied, "I am sorry, my lord, that I do not recognize you. I mistook you for someone important." When he once offended the king himself, legend says Francis granted him one mercy, to choose the manner of his own execution. Triblet, never missing a beat, replied, "Well then, I asked to die of old age." The king laughed and spared him. In Poland, there was Stanzik, not merely a fool, but a symbol of national consciousness. He is remembered not just for laughter, but for warning the king of dangers ignored. In paintings, Stanzik sits somber and thoughtful, while revelers celebrate around him. A reminder that sometimes the wisest voice is the one cloaked in jest. And there were women, too, rare but notable. Mathurin, a jester in court of French kings in the 1600s, dressed as an Amazon warrior, and was known for her quick tongue and theatrical flair. Once, she even disarmed an assassin with nothing but her costume and a sharp mind. Many others are lost to time. Anonymous figures who danced, joked, and vanished. They appear in household records as Tom the Fool or Mad Bess, paid in loaves of bread or bolts of cloth. Their stories, never written, live on only in whispers or family myths. And yet the essence remains. Across cultures, Chinese courtiers, Persian storytellers, African griots, we see the same pattern. One who laughs but speaks truth. One who is lowly but touches kings. The jester is not just a comic relief. He is a bridge between layers of society, between safety and risk, between honesty and absurdity. And in that liminal role, part man, part myth, the jester is deeply human. Even today, some say the spirit of the jester survives. In satire, in parody, in the quiet humor that gets us through dark times. In comedians who point out hard truths, gently or fiercely. In the child who asks uncomfortable questions. In you, perhaps, as you listen and reflect. For though the motley may be gone, the wisdom hidden in laughter still whispers. As we ease into the final stretch of our journey, let us linger within the grandeur of medieval courts, where velvet drapes muffled whispers and candlelight flickered against carved stone. Here, amid nobles and monarchs, the jester moved, quietly powerful in a world of ceremony and constraint. To be a jester at court was to occupy a strange, contradictory space. You were always there, and yet never truly part of it. On the one hand, jesters had access most courtiers only dreamed of. They could approach the king unannounced, speak freely when others were silent, move between ranks without fear of offense. In a rigid world of hierarchy and etiquette, this fluidity was extraordinary, but it came at a cost. Imagine, for a moment, a lavish feast in the great hall of a castle. The table is heavy with roasted meats, honeyed fruits, spice wine. Nobles in silks and gold thread recline on cushioned benches. Musicians play softly in the background. And there, beside the hearth or near the throne, is the jester, brightly dressed, perhaps holding a fool's scepter tipped with a carved head. Smiling faintly, he watches everything. When the food grows dull or the conversation wanes, he's expected to entertain. A joke, a dance, a song. He must know when to lift the mood and when to tread carefully. He must keep the king amused without overstepping. He must mock the court without angering it. He is both mirror and mask. Jesters learn the art of reading a room, of knowing just how far they could push. A poorly timed jest might cost a man his place. Or worse, at times, they were deliberately placed beside powerful figures not for amusement, but for temperance. A jester's sharp observation could warn a ruler of dangerous pride. A clever quip could diffuse tension during council meetings. They became strange advisors, informal but influential. Some jesters lived in luxury, housed in the castle, fed well, clothed in expensive, tailored motley. Others were not so fortunate, sleeping near the kitchens, paid erratically, sometimes treated more as pets than people. And still many endured. Why? Perhaps for the thrill of walking that delicate line. Perhaps for the chance to speak truth in a world of lies. Perhaps because for a time they were seen, truly seen, by the most powerful people of their age. One chronicler wrote of a court where, during a royal tantrum, everyone stood frozen in fear, save the jester, who leaned in and whispered something so ridiculous the king broke into laughter. Just like that, the tension shattered. Lives were spared. Peace returned. The jester's power was never official, but it was real. And what of their personal lives? We know little. Some were former monks or scholars, others peasants with a quick wit. A few were disabled or neurodivergent, seen as touched by God, and granted a unique place in society. Some may have been lonely. Others thrived in the liminal space they occupied. What is clear is that life at court, though dazzling from a distance, could be treacherous. Behind every chuckle was a risk. Behind every jest, a gamble. And through it all, the jester endured. Painted into murals, etched into wood, footnoted in royal diaries. A silent witness to the making and unmaking of kings. Now, let us dim the lights of the royal court just a little further, and reflect on what happened when the laughter stopped. The jester's position, though often envied, was never secure. They were not nobles. They held no official rank. Their fortunes were tied not to their own abilities alone, but to the whims of their patrons. A new king, a moody duke, or a courtier's grudge could send even most beloved fool out into the cold. And sometimes they simply faded away. Picture a jester in middle age, perhaps once sprightly and quick, now slower to leap and less sharp of tongue. The wrinkles in his face have deepened, and his voice, once booming with wit, is hoarser now. The younger nobles find him quaint, not clever. The king, once charmed, now rarely calls for him. What does he do then? Unlike knights or merchants, jesters had no pension, no estate, no legacy, except the echoes of laughter in the stone halls they once brightened. Some transitioned into other roles, musicians, tutors, even scribes if they were literate. Others wander from court to court, try to reclaim their magic. A few found work at fairs or inns, but most would find life beyond the court difficult. Some were simply replaced. Younger jesters were always waiting in the wings, hungrier, louder, more daring. In a world that prized novelty, age was a quiet death sentence. There were even those who fell victim to the very humor they once wielded. In moments of misjudged satire or too honest commentary, a jester might insult the wrong noble. A misplaced barb could lead to exile or worse. While many monarchs tolerated jests, not all forgave them. Historical records, sparse as they are, tell us of jesters imprisoned, whipped, or dismissed for a single misstep. Their fall was not always dramatic. Often it was silent, unmarked. The record simply stops. Others died in obscurity, forgotten by the courts they once served, buried without ceremony, their names lost while those they mocked live on in chronicles and genealogy scrolls. And yet, some jesters managed to etch their legacy into history. Their stories pass from bard to bard, from castle hall to village inn. In these tales, they became symbols of cunning, of truth disguised in humor, of courage that wore a painted grin. But most were not remembered. They did not seek immortality. They sought, perhaps, only to be heard, if only for a moment, to bring a spark of mischief to a world heavy with war and ceremony. The fall of a jester was often gentle, but it carried the same quiet melancholy that drapes all lives when the end draws near. A slow dimming of the light, a softening of the voice, a silence where laughter once lived. In many ways, their stories mirror those of all who stand in service of power, honored while useful, discarded when the times change. And still, in that fading, there is dignity. The jester was more than a performer. He was a witness to history, a keeper of secrets, and, for however brief a time, the voice of the unspeakable. Now, with the final embers of the jester's torch flickering low, we turn our gaze to the shadows left behind, the echoes that continue to ripple softly through time. Imagine, if you will, a dusty old manuscript, resting forgotten on the shelf of a monastery library. Its pages are brittle ink faded, but nestled between somber sermons and family genealogies is a small poem, a verse written in jest, mocking a long-dead lord's oversized codpiece. There is no name signed, but perhaps the jester wrote it, though they rarely held pen or scribe's title. The jester's influence touched the records of the time in more ways than one. Their jokes, whispered or shouted, sung or scribbled, often outlived them in peculiar ways. Some passed into folk tales. Others became anonymous rhymes that children sang in markets without knowing their source. In this way, the jester lingered. Through centuries, the image of the fool evolved. From medieval courts to Shakespearean drama, from satirical broadsheets to modern clowns, always wearing the mask of humor, always walking that fine edge between entertainment and critique. The court jester became a symbol of courage wrapped in comedy, of truth told under the cover of absurdity. Even in modern parlance, we still speak of playing the fool, of fooling the king, or speaking truth to power with a jest. The archetype lives on in jesters of the stage, of politics, even of protest. In many historical dramas and art, you'll see the jester lingering at the edge of scene, never at the center, always near, observing, waiting, occasionally commenting in a way that no knight or priest ever could. This positioning was no accident. Even in memory, they remain outsiders, necessary but not embraced. Treasure, perhaps, but never truly won the court. And yet, in that very marginality, there was freedom. The jester could travel from court to court, adapt to kings and customs, change languages and tricks as needed. They were the wandering comedians of a rigid world, a rare breath of unpredictability in castles built on protocol. And so the legacy of the court jester is not one of fame or fortune, but of influence, indirect and immeasurable. Their legacy is laughter, yes, but also subversion, insight, subtle rebellion. They existed in a world of hierarchy and ceremony, yet defied both. They entertained kings, mocked war, comforted the grieving, and when they dared, pointed at power with a painted grin and said, "This too shall pass." And then they danced away, bells jingling. As we close our eyes now and drift towards sleep, think of them not as jesters with silly hats, as quiet rebels who walk between the lines. Their lives, though filled with laughter, were shaped by constraint. Their legacy, gentle, whispering, enduring, hums quietly beneath the louder tales of kings and battles. Let us remember them not for the jokes they told, but for the courage it took to stand at the feet of kings and speak without fear, and leave behind echoes of humor in the great silence of history. And now, dear listener, our tale gently folds itself to rest, like a jester's costume placed carefully in a wooden chest. The bells quiet, the colors dim by candlelight. We wander through winding corridors of palaces, peeked into the dusty corners of medieval courts, and trace the silent footsteps of those strange, wonderful figures known as jesters. Their stories were never the loudest, never the grandest, but like a quiet harp playing beneath a banquet's roar. Their presence shaped the mood of 1,000 nights. From the moment they donned their patchwork garb, jesters became bridges between the untouchable and the real. Through humor, they voice unspoken truths. Through performance, they ease tension, soothe grief, and offer a rare glimpse of honesty to those surrounded by flattery. Not heroes in the usual sense, not rulers, not warriors, but essential nonetheless. And now, in the stillness of this moment, as the world outside your window fades to a hush, perhaps you feel a quiet kinship with them, a certain sense of watching from the edges, noticing things others overlook. The jester wasn't there to steal the spotlight. He was there to reflect it. Gently, humorously, cleverly, he let others sleep better. And maybe tonight, he's helping you do the same. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's strangely comforting to know who else is out there, falling asleep to the same old stories. So now, with the last flicker of torchlight dancing on stone walls, we close the book for tonight. You've been listening to Sleepy Historian, where boring history becomes your lullaby. May your dreams tonight be soft, your thoughts unhurried, and may the old jester, wherever he wanders, offer a quiet chuckle to carry you gently into sleep. Until next time, rest well